Paul Holt stepped out of his office in the large Victorian frame house on the lakeshore and pulled the rope on the brass bell mounted on the porch railing. He brushed his thick blonde hair away from his eyes and leaned back against the railing as the counselor trainees gathered in front of him. At 25, he was senior to the oldest of them by a mere 6 years, and he was painfully aware of his responsibility to take charge immediately and make sure they all did their jobs. If this counselor training session went well, and the camp officials he had contracted with were pleased with the results, there was a good chance he'd get referrals to other summer camps and be able to double his enrollment next year. It was an excellent way of adding a couple of weeks of extra work to the summer season and building up a part-time vacation business for himself. He got to spend an enjoyable few weeks in the woods running his own business and picking up some extra money for grad school. He looked around, trying to remember all their names as they started to come out from the other cabins where they had been unpacking and settling in. There was Mark, a dark, muscular boy of about 18, confined to a wheelchair as a result of a tragic motorcycle accident. Yet, despite his handicap, he was remarkably self-sufficient. He'd been an excellent role model for the kids at camp, proving that you could accomplish whatever you set your mind to. Vicky, a pretty, leggy brunette of about 17, came up behind Mark as he struggled to get his wheelchair through the soft dirt and up a slight incline to the main house. She offered to help him with a push, but Mark resolutely shook his head, making the well-meaning girl look hurt, as if he had rejected her. Paul sighed. Perhaps Mark was a bit too self-sufficient. There were a few things he was going to have to learn, but they were the sort of things that no one would be able to teach him. He'd have to come to them by himself. Often, people who were handicapped became overly sensitive to other people trying to help them. In a sense, it was understandable, because no one wanted to be pitied or condescended to. And all too often, otherwise well-meaning people could become very intrusive, such as grabbing a handicapped person's wheelchair and pushing it without bothering to ask if their help was wanted. But there was a difference between an intrusive person and someone offering to help out of a genuine desire to be supportive. Even if you didn't want the help and felt it was important for you to make it on your own, there was no reason why you couldn't smile and thank the person for the offer, refusing graciously. A simple shake of the head, such as Mark had given Vicky, was not meant as a rejection, because Mark was not inconsiderate, and he probably felt self-conscious about the difficulty he was having, but Vicky had taken it as such. It was plain by the hurt expression on her face. Maybe we put too much emphasis on being self-sufficient and independent, Paul thought watching them. Instead of stressing competitiveness, perhaps we ought to stress accomplishment instead. Not for the sake of winning, but just for the joy of it, with the focus on achieving things together. Maybe then we wouldn't have such a hard time communicating, and people might not get hurt so easily. Terry, a shapely girl of 18, was coming down the hiking trail with her dog, Muffin, tagging along behind her. Paul had some doubts about her decision to bring that dog along. It wasn't exactly an outdoor dog, like a shepherd or a setter. It was one of those cute little lap dogs, about the size of a football, and it was all hair and ribbons. Paul didn't understand why anyone would wrap a dog up like a Christmas present. The dog would pick up a million brambles in country like this, not to mention fleas and ticks, and Lord only knew what sort of parasites from the lakes and streams. And in the woods, a domestic dog wouldn't stand a chance against the sort of wildlife it could encounter. Paul had even seen German shepherds get done in by raccoons, who were a lot more ferocious than they looked and canny enough to lure the dogs into a river or a pond and then drown them by climbing on their heads and clinging there. Even on bare ground, a coon could give a hunting dog one hell of a bad time. A little hairball like Muffin wouldn't last 3 seconds. However, there wasn't much he could do about it now. She had brought the dog with her, and it seemed pointless to make an issue out of it. Terry would find out for herself that there was a lot of difference between the wilderness and a city park. As she came down the hill, Scott stepped out from behind a stand of bushes and took aim at her denim cutoffs with a wooden slingshot. He let the elastic fly, and the pebble struck Terry in the ass. Crying out, she brought her hand back instinctively and spun around as Scott stepped out from behind the bushes. He tapped the slingshot lightly against his chin, giving her a smoldering look and a wink. Terry grimaced wryly and turned around, continuing back down toward the main house. Seeing them, Paul thought that some guys never outgrew the dipping the pigtails in ink stage. Ted came up, not watching where he was going, and banged into the porch steps because he was so engrossed in his pocket computer game. He rubbed his shin and looked up at Paul sheepishly, then sat down on the steps. It was a heck of a crew, thought Paul. It looked like he had his work cut out for him. And to top things off, Ginny hadn't even shown up yet. Things were getting off to a somewhat shaky start. "Okay, let's settle down," he said, consulting with his clipboard and looking around at them. With the exception of Ginny, everyone seemed to be present. "It's great to have you all here at our new counselor training center," he said. "You've all worked as counselors at one camp or another. Terry, Vicky, you two were upstate last summer, right? Scott, hi! Good to see you here, buddy. You'll need it." The others laughed as Scott shook his head wearily. "And Mark?" Paul continued. "I know we worked a season or two together, right?" Mark smiled at the recognition. "The rest of you I'll get to know soon enough," Paul went on, noting several new faces. "I'm also sure there's one thing I don't have to tell any of you. Being a counselor isn't the gravy summer job everyone thinks it is. And what we're going to do over the next 2 weeks, if the rest of my staff ever shows up, is go back to the basics. Survival, first aid, boating, archery, rifle range, all of it." He was about to go on when what sounded like the crack of a rifle shot startled everyone, and they all turned around to see a dilapidated red Volkswagen convertible come banging down the dirt road leading into the camp, backfiring like a glutton at a chili cook-off and kicking up a cloud of dust. "What the hell?" said Paul. The VW bug swerved into the camp and skidded to a stop beneath some trees. The driver was an attractive young woman in a white sleeveless blouse and pink skirt. Her blonde hair was pinned up. She looked relieved as she leaned back against the seat with a sigh, shutting off the noisy motor. Ginny, Paul thought. Of course. What else was he supposed to expect? It was hard enough trying to run a training session with a bunch of kids who probably just wanted to smoke dope and run off into the woods together without having your first assistant showing up late in a ratty old VW with gas pains. Where had she picked up that wreck? And why? "I'll be right back," he said to Ted. He went over to the car. "Hi," said Jenny cheerfully. "I'm late." Paul gave her a hard stare. "Come with me," he said. She shrugged and followed him up to one of the other cabins. They went up the steps of the porch, and he beckoned her inside, then closed the door behind them. Once out of sight of the others, he turned on her angrily. "What's this crap, Ginny?" he said. "You're supposed to be my assistant. Everyone else got here hours ago." "I said I'm sorry," she interrupted. "You did?" She grimaced wryly, realizing that she hadn't said any such thing. "I'm sorry, okay? My car's sick." "You could have called." "Paul, I did try. Your phones aren't working yet." Paul took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She did have a point there. The telephone should have been taken care of by now, but, of course, they were still off. He should have pursued that, but with so much going on, he had spaced it. "All right," he said, easing up. "Get your gear stowed and help me outside, okay?"
"Paul, look,"
Ginny said.
"the course starts today. Here I am. And I promise you, I'll never be late again in my entire life."
Paul raised his eyebrows skeptically.
"Well,"
she said.
"do we have a deal?"
He chuckled. All right. What the hell?" He put his arms around her and pulled her close. "I was starting to worry about you." She smiled and kissed him on the nose.
"Bullshit, Paul."
They went back outside, and Paul was a bit disconcerted to see the grins on all their faces. He tried to look more serious as he pretended to consult his clipboard, hoping his embarrassment wouldn't show. "Put your car on the lot, okay?" he said to Ginny without looking up. "This place is starting to look like a Burger King." He looked back up at the counselors. "All right, where was I?" "You were about to give us your 'let's keep our shit together' speech," said Ted, grinning. Paul gave him a look, and he quickly added, "Mr. Holt." "Right," said Paul. "Okay." He looked around at the group. They were all doing their best to look very serious. He shook his head. "A few words about safety, okay?" Ginny got behind the wheel of the old VW Bug and turned the key in the ignition. The starter made a terrible grinding noise. "Now I want running kept to a minimum," said Paul, continuing his speech. "Respect the equipment we'll be handling." Ginny kept trying the ignition, but the starter just kept grinding, draining the battery. The counselors were paying more attention to her efforts than they were to Paul. "Axes, knives, saws," Paul continued, undaunted. "They can all be trouble. Their misuse is the main cause of camp accidents." Ginny kept trying to start the car relentlessly, and for a moment it seemed as if her stubbornness was going to pay off. The motor caught for a second, then backfired violently, coughed, and died. "Take care of your equipment," Paul went on, ignoring her, "and it'll take care of you." Ginny slumped back in the car seat with a sigh, looking defeated. She glanced back toward the counselors and saw that most of them were watching her rather than listening to Paul. She grinned and shrugged. "Now, a word of caution about our friends in the forest," Paul said. Scott and Mark exchanged glances. Scott mouthed, "Friends in the forest?" and rolled his eyes. Mark stifled a laugh. "Among other things," Paul went on, oblivious to their reactions, "this is bear country, and contrary to what everybody hears, bears are dangerous. I don't want to see any sloppy use of food around the camp. A black bear can smell a cookie a mile away." Jeff and Sandra giggled. "That means no food fights," Paul said seriously. "And those nights we camp out, no eating in your tents. Change often. If you're a woman, don't use perfume. And keep clean during your menstrual cycle." Vicky and Terry exchanged glances, hardly able to believe he had actually said that. Meanwhile, Ginny had gone back to trying to start her car again, with no more success than the last time. Paul finally relented and went over to see what he could do to help. "Having trouble?" he said. She looked up at him and nodded, sighing heavily. "You've got to treat 'em gentle," Paul said with mock seriousness. "Just like kids. Use a little of that child psychology you're majoring in." Ginny made a face at him as he walked around behind the car and opened the motor compartment. He loosened the wing nut, holding the air cleaner cover on, and took out the air filter. It was filthy and clogged beyond belief. He shook out as much dirt as possible, then checked her distributor cap and tightened it. With the air filter still off, he placed his hand over the carburetor intake. "Try it," he said. Ginny turned the key and the motor kicked over, coughing once and sending a spray of soot all over Paul. Coughing, he squinted and waved his hand in front of his face, then replaced the air filter and the cover. Ginny backed up until she was even with him, and with a grin said,
"It's more fun using child psychology on you."
She winked.
"You're such a sucker for it."
Paul watched her with irritation as she swung the car around and rattled off toward the parking lot. He shook his head. She always did it to him. Every single time. No matter what it was, she simply grinned and shrugged it off, as if life were nothing but a joke. He glanced back toward the counselors, who weren't even trying to hide their smiles anymore. Well, at least they thought it was funny. He, however, wasn't laughing. She was always accusing him of being too serious. Well, perhaps he was at times, but here, at camp, there was a reason for everything, including his seriousness. For the most part, these kids were from the city and the suburbs. They weren't like country kids who grew up around the woods and had a healthy respect for the wilderness. Just as you didn't walk alone down on Canal Street in New York City at 1 o'clock in the morning. There were certain precautions you took in the woods. How could these trainees ever hope to teach small children such things if they didn't take them seriously themselves? He looked back at them and sighed. Well, it was early yet. They were only getting started. There was still plenty of time for them to get it all together, assuming they applied themselves. Otherwise, they were liable to learn that the woods could be just as dangerous a place as any unlit alley at night.